here, Plastering For Beginners, and today we're going to focus on sponge float plastering. But the biggest question is, why would you change from traditional to sponge floating in the first place? Well, this is a big question a lot of plasterers have been having. There's been a lot of debates whether it's the right way to do things, whether it's British Gypsum approved. But basically, I've just got a few reasons why I've changed to this on this particular job. So, for example, old walls, been using a lot of multi-finish, and to be honest, it's just not been great. The batches I've been getting have been a bit hit and miss. Some batches have been good, some plaster's been drying extremely fast, and especially, this is my biggest pet hate, right? I'm on my little high horse here. Working on British Gypsum bonding. So I've applied it, I PVA it, I do everything that you should do, British Gypsum approved, and every time you use a multi-finish, 2 separate coats, it always bubbles and blisters, and I cannot stop it from blistering, and I don't know why. I don't know if I've got a dodgy batch of plaster, but it's been a nightmare on this job because I've had so much patching to do, and once it blisters, it's really hard. If you're a plasterer, you know this, it's really hard to get the blisters out, so you've got to trowel them out, sharp them off, and it's not nice. So a little clip here on a job I did a few weeks ago of where it's blistering up, and I'll just show you exactly what I mean. So this column was bonded out, I've got loads of blisters, it's been PVA'd, 2 separate coats, blisters, 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 blisters. So this has been a constant thing for me at the moment. Every time plastering onto bonding, it blisters up and they're a nightmare to get rid of. No matter what I do, what PVA, I'm guessing at the moment British Gypsum want us to use Bond It. So that's what I'm talking about. You can see it in the footage, you can see the blistering, you can see the areas where are affected, and it's just been a bit of a pain. Some of the gypsum I've had, the multi-finish, has been setting extremely fast as well. Sometimes it's the background you're working on, but sometimes it's just some of the bags have been gritty, hard to work with, and sometimes a bit painful. So I used the sponge float about 2 weeks ago. I think I did a video on it, first time in ages, and it's made a world of difference. It's helped with the setting time, and to be honest, I've not only been getting a better finish, but it's been a lot easier. So today's video, I'm going to walk through sponge float plastering again. I've had a few more goes since my last video, as I'm going to walk you through the full process and how I did it, and I'm going to talk about how I did it differently to previous videos. Previous videos I did it a lot differently. So for example, I'd flatten the walls a lot more, get it almost finished, and then sponge flow it up. And to be honest, I was getting to the point where I was thinking, why am I doing all that work and then sponging it? So I'm going to show you in this video how I'm going to do it now, how I tackle it on this job, and how I have been doing it, and the results I've been getting. And I've been, must admit, quite impressed. It's been quite good. And I'm also going to talk about which sponge float to use and how to do it. So let's crack on, let's get on with the video. Cheers. Okay, this job we're on today, as you can see, there's quite a bit of patching been done. That whole back wall where the fireplace is, that's been floated up. We use British Gypsum hard wall because this is actually going to be a bathroom. You don't want to be using bonding in bathroom because it absorbs moisture, so we've got to use hard wall for this instance. But still, the idea is the same. When I've been plastering onto bonding in the past, it's been bubbling up, it's been pretty hard to get a finish, and at times, multi-finish has been temperamental, like we've said. So, it's the idea of using the sponge float today because it's just helping to get a better finish when you've got different areas and different patches going on. So, where we're going from hard wall to the normal finish, all the walls have been PVA'd, but there's always that bit of difference between the two. And we'll show you in this video how sponge floating can really take that out. So what we're doing here, we're just applying the plaster. I'm not going to go into logistics of application, just for the people who have seen this already. If you are interested in learning the process of applying the plaster, mixing it, learning the basics of how to plaster a wall from start to finish, feel free to sign up to our beginner's welcome course. We'll take you through all of the instructions you need there. So yeah, there's a link below in the description, or we'll talk about it more at the end. But the idea is here, we're just applying first coat of plaster, nothing crazy and nothing new, and you'll see how high these ceilings are with this little clip coming up now. Embarrassing when you've got a full bath height with a plyboard on it to do this wall and the ceiling, and you still need to hop up. Short man problems. Yep, I'm a short ass. Anyway, we applied the first coat of plaster. All I'm doing is using a speed skim here to flatten it up. And this is just getting ready for the second coat. Just getting it ready, prepped and primed, so I can apply the second coat and we've got a flat surface to work on. You can flatten it by a trowel, you don't need a speed skim, but it just takes all the hard work out of the job. And then we're jumping straight onto applying the second coat of plaster, starting from the top left, working across to the right. Same old, nothing new here. All we're doing is just getting the plaster on the walls, ready for when it comes to flattening and sponge floating. So again, just apply the plaster, starting from the top and then working our way down across the bottom. So all this is very much the same. It's the same way as doing traditional plastering. There's nothing different here, and there's not much difference between the sponge float process other than the actual sponging part. So I'm going to go into exactly where and how to do it. So all we're doing now is flattening the second coat with a speed skim. So this is where it starts getting different. In older videos where I used to do sponge float plastering in the past, I'd flatten the wall, I'd close in with a speed skim, I'd flatten it again, and then I'd probably flatten it one more time, and then I'd use a sponge float. But to me, I started to think, why am I flattening it so much and going into so much work getting it flat to mess it up again with the sponge float and make it almost back to scratch? So with the new thought, I did a video on this last week, but the new way I'm looking at sponge floating now is to start the sponging a lot earlier. So all I'm doing here is getting rid of the ripples, getting rid of the high spots in the plaster, and what I'm doing is using the speed skim to get the wall flat. I'm not going to worry about any marks, I'm not going to worry about any little lines. All we're doing now is getting the wall flat, and now is when we're going into using the sponge float. Okay, so now is where things change. Nothing has been different from the process we've done so far plastering. Applied a first coat, applied second coat, flattened with a speed skim. Now is where we start looking at sponge floating. So now is where we get the sprayer. I'm using it's a hose lock pulsar, it's called, and it's probably one of the best sprayers I've used so far for sponge floating because it's solid, it doesn't leak. It's about 35 quid from B&Q, but it's well worth the dough. But that is irrelevant really. You can get any pressure sprayer, it doesn't really matter. That's not going to affect performance. But I will talk about the sponge. This is the Raffina medium soft sponge float. So here it is, it says it there, that's the label. And it's the reason this is so effective is because it's medium but it's very soft. It'll move, so when you are coming to sponge floating, it's not too hard, it's not going to drag the plaster and it's not going to pull it away. That's what I was finding with the other sponge float I was using in the other video. So this is, like I said, the medium sponge float. So this is the best one I've found for results, and I just had to make a point on that. This is the best one to use. You don't want anything too firm, you want it to have a bit of, you want it to be slightly softer, because again, all we're doing, we are floating a plaster, but it's not like render, it is a finished plaster. So let's get onto it. I'm going to show you the difference now from sponge float to traditional plastering, and we'll see what finishes we can get. So let's do it, let's see how it goes. Let's carry on. Thank you so much for watching. Cheers. Okay, so we're giving the walls a decent spray with water. We're not putting too much water on here. There's no point because the plaster is still quite wet. And this is the other thing. All we're doing is putting a fine spray on. Just a light mist. Because we don't need to use too much water. We don't really need to saturate the plaster. And we're giving it less chance of over adding too much water to the mix, which is what British Gypsum, I think, are worried about. Now this is the difference between using the medium soft sponge float. Look how easy it glides a 8. So I'm using figure of 8 motions to really flatten that wall. But look how fluid that is, and compare it to the fine sponge I used last week. It gets caught. This is a fine, harder sponge, I think. So you want to avoid the hard sponges and you want to go for the medium soft sponge float. It's just so much easier to use and it's not as aggressive. It doesn't pull the plaster. And if you look, we're only adding a minuscule, we're adding the texture, but it's not too deep. As you can see, it's not too harsh. It's got a fine texture on it, but we're not taking too much out of it. So all you really need to do is just wet the sponge up before you start using it, and then you just figure eight motions, just getting rid of any high spots and getting the wall flat essentially. This is different sponge float plastering. I do believe your walls end up a lot flatter when you are sponging, and especially if you combine that with the speed skim. So what I'm doing is I'm going on the speed skim straight away. With the older videos when I used to do sponge float plastering, I used to wait for the plaster to take up a little bit, but because we're using the speed skim, because it's plastic, it doesn't pull the moisture from the back of the plaster to the front, and what we're doing, we're closing this wall in so much faster, so we don't need to wait to flatten the lines out. Because this is again a plastic material, it's not going to affect the plaster in the sense of livening it back up again. What we're actually doing is speeding up the drying process here, and the speed skim just helps to get the wall really flat. But I do recommend using the speed skim ST. I would not use the steel speed skim at this point, it's too flexible, and I think you'd risk creating more ripples in the plaster. Again, back in the past I used to use a flexi trowel. At this point I'm only using stiff trowels, and I'm going to avoid flexis until the wet trowel towards the end, as I would normal traditional plastering. What we want is to get this wall flatter. We don't want to risk it with a flexi trowel by ruining it and creating ripples. So now what I'd usually do is I'd probably jump on another wall, one that I've sponged and floated in the past, do that, and then I'd come back a few minutes later until I use my trowel again. Because what we're doing now is, when you've used the speed skim, there's going to be a few little areas where it wasn't flattened, there's going to be a few little sponge lines. All we're doing now is troweling them out, and we're just continuing to get that wall flat. So again, with the speed skim, there might be a few areas where it's left a bit of indentation where the speed skim stopped, or again where the sponge is still showing. This is where you want to use your trowel to flatten them out, but you don't want to wait too long. Don't wait longer than 5 minutes, because what happens is the sponge lines will dry and they will set, and once they set you can't get them out. So you don't want to wait too long after the speed skim to flatten your plaster with the trowel, because it will leave a detrimental effect. So again, all I'm doing now is flattening anything that I've left behind, and then after this the stress is over. The only stress when you are sponge float plastering is that the sponge marks will dry. And like I said, again, I keep saying that because first time I did sponge float plastering, didn't have a clue what I was doing. Sponged the wall, wetted it up, waited for about 10 minutes, and all of the sponge lines that are left on the wall dried and they were all left, and you could see them all on full show. So never wait too long before you trowel out the sponge marks. It's just not good.
Time to clean up. Boring.
As I said, the boring bit is to clean up. Now you can get rid of the sponge float, clean it up, get rid of all the plaster that's on the sponge, get rid of it as soon as you've used it, because what happens, it will dry and it will clog up the sponge, and you'll get through about 2 a week if you leave it to dry like that. So just make sure you have a proper clean up on the sponge. And then all we're doing, now I've gone round, done the other 2 walls that I was working on and a few reveals. Now what we're doing is just troweling the walls again. So a bit of water and we're just troweling up. This time all we're doing is just getting the wall flatter and flatter. So we're not really worrying about the sponge marks, because they should have been troweled out previously. So all we're doing now is just troweling as you would usually, and then that's it. So we're just going to finish troweling this wall. Then we're going to get back and then show you how the wall looks after a sponge float. It does make a massive difference, and it does give a cracking finish. So let's keep this, let's trowel this wall, and let's get back to that in a minute.
Let's have a look.
So this is just a wet trowel on that particular section. You can see that wall is nice, smooth and looking very flat. So that is the difference sponge floating can do, and that's what the results you can expect. Again, all it is with the sponge floating is you just got to be careful with your timings, and it does take a bit of work. It does take a bit of manoeuvring to make sure you're not troweling constantly, because if you keep troweling your wall, you're livening the wall up and you're bringing the moisture to the surface, and you're actually preventing it from drying properly. So the one thing I will do is learn to hold off a bit when you are sponge floating and allow the wall to dry. But again, it's that fine line between waiting too long and the wall setting. So it just takes a bit of practice, but you can get a decent finish without over troweling your walls and without spending all your life trying to get it flat. So that's results you can get when you are sponge float plastering. On this job, like I said, there's been a lot of patching, a lot of work with bonding, a lot of work with hardwall, and it just gets rid of that stress of bubbles and just get rid of that fear that the wall isn't going to react as well as it could do, especially with setting times and how fast it's been going off with multi recently. So it is definitely a good trick to use, great finish, and it's always nice to have as backup to have the sponge float just in case the wall isn't acting the way you'd like it to. That's the finish.
Lovely.
Happy days, nothing wrong with that. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, I hope you enjoyed watching. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe, and make sure you watch the next one. Cheers.